I want to thank you all for coming here, being here, and this momentous occasion. So what we'll do is have an interview from, well, first maybe I should introduce. This is Megumi, Grace Fleming, storyteller and historian of the Japanese internment and World War II experience. And this is Eiko and Jimmy Yamachi. And we'll hear an interview with them, and then there will be time for questions afterward. So they have some of your questions here. They can answer those, and then others might have other questions. So if you just welcome them, we'll start.
First of all, if you have a cell phone, please turn it off. Thank you. Sorry about that. So my name is Megumi, and my family did not go to the camps. My mother's side is Japanese. They're Japanese citizens, which is very different from the Japanese who immigrated and became citizens over here. My father is Caucasian, so they were the ones that said, oh, these Japanese people are spies? Anyway, I became interested in the Japanese-American experience when I met a woman named Linda, and we were swapping World War II stories. And even though I had gone to college and learned about Japanese-American internment, I only learned the material for a grade. I wanted an A- at least. So I memorized like historical facts, the numbers, the people, but I didn't really get it. And when Linda told me her family story, I said, what? This is something every American should know, not just in a history book or in an ethnic studies class where you're trying to get a good grade like me, but in a way, as long as we can, while the people who were in the camps can still tell us the stories. I met Jimmy and Eiko, and I was delighted. Jimmy knows a lot. Those of you who read this article know that he knows a lot about Tule Lake and was instrumental in helping the museum. But Eiko, even though she might be quiet and she stays in the background, once you start talking to her, you realize she has an amazing memory too and wonderful stories. So I'm very, very happy that they're both here. I have a lot of questions here, and I won't be able to get to all of them, but I will do my best. I've interviewed over 70 people who were in the camps, so I might act a little smug. I'm sorry if I do. Okay, so first we'll start out by me doing a sample interview, and then you'll get to know them a little bit. In the sample interview, we might be able to answer some of these questions too. Okay, does that sound good? Okay, thank you. So I typically go to people's homes with a video camera like the one over there, ask them for permission, of course, and I start writing down things as they answer. So Jimmy and Eiko, thank you for allowing me to come to your home and letting me videotape you too. I will give you a copy. Jimmy and Eiko, can you start by saying when and where you were born?
Well, I was born in San Jose. I was number 4, and well, let's see, I'll be the 4th one in the family, the 3rd son, born in 1922 in a midwife house. Majority of us Japanese immigrants were born or delivered in midwife, because the fact that the mothers couldn't understand English, couldn't go to the hospital, plus they were not allowed to go into the hospital to deliver babies, so that's how majority of us was delivered by midwife.
A Japanese midwife?
Japanese midwife,
okay.
generally. Mm-hmm.
All Eiko, can you say where you were born and when, and if you were born?
Yeah. I was born in Seattle, October 25th, 1924. He forgot to tell you he's one of 10 kids. But I only come from 3, and I was the eldest. I have 2 younger brothers.
Okay. Were you also delivered by a midwife?
I don't think so. I was in the hospital, I think.
You were in the hospital. Oh, so different levels of racism maybe in Seattle versus
Yeah.
San Jose.
Yeah, because at the time, the first Japanese American doctor that was allowed to practice in San Jose Hospital was 1934. So he spent almost 2 years just floating around, even though he graduated from Stanford in med school. Later on, he was the top-notch surgeon in San Jose Hospital when he was able to practice.
Was he Issei or Nisei?
Nisei.
Issei.
Nisei.
Nisei. So he was born here. He
Born
was an
here.
American citizen, but he was still.
Not allowed to practice in San Jose Hospital. So the 1930s. So, like my brother, the oldest one, my mother met another lady coming from Japan. They said, "Well, you deliver my baby, and I'll deliver your baby." So that was fine. But the second one got to be a little bit chore, so then went to midwife. And then my younger sister, number 10, that's when Dr. Watanabe got licensed to practice in 1934. And she went to the hospital and had Dr. Watanabe deliver her. So out of 10, 8 of us was delivered by midwife.
Okay. So there's a big difference between the first generation that came here, immigrated from Japan, and those of you who were born here in this country. Because obviously you speak English perfectly, so you understand everything that's going on. What was it like growing up with parents who could only understand a little bit of English?
It was a lot of hardship. I grew up during the Depression years. I went to school. It was 1927. I went to first grade. Naturally, my father spoke mostly Japanese strong, and his English wasn't all that great, but it was one of the vulgar English. You know, that he always argued with the merchants selling vegetables. So I picked up all those bad languages. When I went to school, that's all came out. So I flunked the first year.
Oh no. So vulgar language.
Yeah.
They have vulgar language even in the 20s, huh?
Oh, definitely.
How about you? What was it like being the English speaker and your parents speaking mostly?
At that time, now that I think back to it, I didn't notice any difference. Although when I took a class in college over here, the professor asked, "How many of you are ESL?" And I said, "Oh, ESL, yeah, English as a second language." And I didn't raise my hand, and he looked at me. He says, "Well, how about you?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, you spoke Japanese at home and English in the American school, and after you left home?" So yeah, well, then English was a second language. So all those years, I never thought of that way.
Thought of you that way.
Yeah.
Did you grow up interpreting for your parents?
A little bit, yeah. But my father worked in a produce house, so he had a lot of contact with the different people, so his English was much better than the average Issei.
I see. So it went beyond the vulgar language.
Yeah.
All right. So both of you grew up during the Depression. That's a big deal that colors your experience during the war. From what I understand, by 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, families had sort of been climbing out of the Depression, right? Because the Depression started in 29, and you struggled through the 30s, and when the 40s came, people were buying newer cars or the first refrigerator and things like that. Eiko, I remember a story about refrigerator.
Yeah. In those days, they didn't have credit cards or credit per se, so you had to have enough cash to buy whatever you wanted to buy. And so up until my father was able to save enough money to buy a GE refrigerator, we had an old wooden ice box, and the iceman would come deliver the ice to different homes with big blocks, and it was my job as the eldest child to make sure that the ice was in the proper compartment, and that I had a catch basin for the ice when it melted, and I had to make sure that I disposed of the water every so many hours, you know. And so I remember that's when my father was able to afford this GE refrigerator. I was so happy, but that was in 1940, so we didn't really have the refrigerator very long since the war came along and all these things happened. And so my enjoyment of the refrigerator was very short-lived.
I know that some students want to know if you lost everything or how much you lost because of the camp experience. Was the refrigerator one of the things that you were able to hold on to, or
my
lost?
father sold it for $10. And he bought it for, I think, $125 or something like that. It was quite expensive at that time.
Even back then, it cost over $100.
Yeah, because the refrigerator is just coming into being, you know.
Coming into being. So you actually had electricity at your house. Okay. Would you like to say something about what you might have lost or not lost because of the camps?
Well, our family was more fortunate, but I think the East States were, I won't say shrewd, they were figured some way that they could buy land one way or the other. Well, in the early turn of the century there, the people in the valley, they thought, well, they can have a child that's born in this country, then the land be under the child's name. Well, somebody figured that out, that no, you can't do that. It says, how could the child that's been just born would be able to own the land, because there's no income, right? Mm-hmm. So they took the land away from those people, and then they turned around and said, now do you want to buy it back? So that's when a lot of the valley people formed a co-op. Different management people had an old enough niece that was 21, and everything be under his name. So in that respect, my father said, well, he farmed as a, say, tenant farmer, everything on a handshake, because they could not lease or own the land or nothing like that. So the Caucasian man was Charles Pratt, says he'll lease or own or rent or farm 15 acres of land. Now, when he farmed the land, my father would raise the produce, sell it, and give them price, and in turn, the cost of raising it and everything else. Then the check would not go back to my father. My father would not receive it. At the time, they used to call it draft. Now they call it check or whatever, invoicing. And the money will go to Charles Brandt. And Charles Brandt will deduct so much to put the roads in, so much to bring electric wire in because we had the new pump, and so much payment to the pumps. And then after all said and done, he'll take out for the cost of operation, then the rental of the land, then on top of that, the use of his name. Charles Brandt number 7, that's from, but that ranch was Charles Brandt number 7.
I'm going to stop you here for a second, just see if they understand what you're talking about. So does everybody understand how this area was all farmland in the early times? And that if you were a Japanese citizen, it was against, you couldn't own land. I don't know if that was covered in this, this document. No, okay. So racist law said if you're Japanese, you can't buy land. So what Mr. Yamaichi was saying is that, so the Japanese who couldn't become U.S. citizens either because of a racist law said, oh, well, our children are American, they can own land. So as soon as a child was born, at the beginning, before more laws were enacted, said, oh, well, my baby boy, it will be under my baby boy, then it will be lawful for our family to own land. But then laws cut up, and a new law was passed saying, oh, well, if you're an American citizen, you also have to be an adult, especially if you're from Japan, if your family's from Japan, to do that. So then the farmers got together and they formed corporations. Corporations, even if they're run by Japanese people, could own land. So Mr. Jimmy Yamaichi is talking about different ways the immigrants tried to get around these racist laws to be able to survive in the Santa Clara Valley and all up and down the coast, right?
All California.
Right. And then he was talking about being a tenant farmer.
Yeah.
Does everybody know what that is? That's what Mr. Jimmy was talking about. So an American Caucasian man would own some land, and then you could call it leasing, but when you could do all the growing of the produce, but once you sell the produce, you don't get the check if you're of Japanese extraction. It went to the Caucasian man that owned the land. And then after he deducted all kinds of expenses, then your family got some money.
Yeah, I think the biggest part of the whole setup was the royalty of using that man's name. And my father figured that up after 10 years. He said he figured probably approximately $20,000 he paid royalty alone just to use his name. So if that's the case, when I own the land, the chance of losing it is just as great as farming as a tenant farmer. So there was a fellow down the street, a Japanese fellow, turned 21. So in 1931, bought the land under his name as Cal Hashimoto. So that way there.
So he didn't have any sons who were 21 yet?
No, not yet.
Not yet. So then he had another neighbor buy it.
And under his name.
And
yes.
he gambled that he wouldn't just take it.
That's right.
Okay.
So that's how they. So by 1939, my oldest brother turned 21, and surprisingly, my father paid for the land through that Depression year. In 1939, the farm was paid for. So it was one of those things we were fortunate that my father foresaw of buying the land, even though chance of losing it was just as great as making it.
I see. So lots of gambling involved
Definitely.
to survive.
Yeah, I think at this one point I'd like to stress, naturally the Chinese, the Indian, they call them, at the time they call them Hindu. I don't know which part of India it is, but they were the biggest immigrants. And the Japanese government told the U.S. when they were trying to bring the Japanese laborers into the United States, were Chinese, they were not allowed to bring their wives. So most of them were smuggled in, and then they had the wives. So anyway, the Japanese government said, if you can take our men folks, you have to take the wives too. But just then, the turning of the so-called world power, as you know today, who's got the muscle? At the time, Japan, turn of the century, Japan defeated the Russians in Vladivostok. They sunk the whole Russian fleet in Vladivostok. So they were kind of scared that Japan might come to the United States and sink their ships or something like that. So anyway, they consented that they were allowed to let the wives or spouse come in to the United States right behind them, or together. So that's the reason why the Japanese had a family function a lot earlier, and the farming, they were able to start up real fast, where the Chinese could not do that because they were all single.
Okay. Yeah.
What happened to the land after they came back from the detention camp?
What happened to your So we're going back to the original question, Jimmy. We
I'm sorry.
meandered over. It's all very interesting things, especially if you're interested in all that history. He was trying to explain why the Japanese immigrants actually had children as soon as they came over versus the Chinese who didn't, and they needed paper sons and all that. Okay, but back to the question. What happened to the land? Were you able to hold on to the land after you came back from the camps or while you were in the
Well,
camps?
before we went to camp, we were debating to sell the land and keep the equipment and move inland. We were allowed, we were given, I think, not quite a month window to move in voluntarily inland to Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, and so forth. The first group that moved in, it was so hostile that people said, heck, we better not go.
I'll do that part. You do your part.
Yeah,
Your
my part.
family. Yeah,
But
yeah.
Anyway, we discussed that, and then we had a Frenchman was selling insurance to us for a number of years, and he says, Yamaichi says, why don't you just sell your equipment and keep the land? I'll just be a custodian. I'll just receive the money and pay the bills, pay the taxes, and then any surplus money we'll put it in the bank. Where some people get power attorney and lost the land because power attorney could do anything with it. So anyway, that's how our land was saved.
So Mr. Yamaichi is saying that in his case, they had a trustworthy acquaintance who was willing to look after your land
Yeah.
so that they didn't lose the land. So they had the land to come back to, which is not the case of a lot of people. And Mr. Yamaichi was also saying that, well, because they gave this man from France, or he was French American or whatever, okay, the power of attorney, legal right to the land, he could have been mean and said, hey, it's mine. I'm not giving it back to you. So you're saying that you were fortunate that you had a trustworthy Caucasian man who took care of your land. Okay. All right. So moving on, because you're interested in the pre-war stuff, it sort of sets a nice foundation for the questions that come afterwards. So I'll start to tackle some of these questions about the these questions about the camps. Well, so here's a question about racism and discrimination against you. I think it was valuable that you talked about before the war, that there was plenty of racism before the war, and these racist laws even. So how did you feel the racism getting worse right after Pearl Harbor was bombed? You know, did it escalate, or was it just about the same except it was outside? Or can you say something about your personal experiences with racial discrimination?
I was a junior in high school at that time.
Okay.
I was a junior in high school at that time, and students who I thought were understanding and were my friends started to avoid me. And in the meantime, the government issued a curfew law where we were only allowed to a radius of 5 miles from our home. And my high school happened to be a little bit more than 5 miles, so I got an exception and I was able to go to high school. But as the evacuation order came through, it was more important that I stay closer to home. So toward the end there, I was not able to finish my junior year in high school.
So timeline-wise, we're talking about Japan bombed Pearl Harbor December, and right after that, a whole bunch of people were arrested just because they were community leaders. But also, these curfews and occurred with 5-mile radiuses, which meant a lot of people couldn't go to work or school or actually conduct their businesses. But also, they froze bank accounts if you had a bank account. So that's what Eiko was referring to, how she had to have some special exception so that she could continue to attend high school. So we're talking about December now. And then you read about Executive Order 9066 when the president actually gave power to the Army to remove people of Japanese descent. Well, that was signed in February, but it didn't go into effect immediately. I mean, the Army had to organize themselves to do that. So Mr. Yamaichi was referring to a few weeks period of time where the Japanese Americans, if they chose to move to a non-military zone, anywhere away from the West Coast, voluntarily, they could do so. That's what he touched on a little bit earlier. And then Eiko was talking about there were a few weeks when, before her family was removed by the Army to the camps, where she was still in town, but couldn't finish high school. So even though the order was signed in February, a lot of families began to be moved in February, March, April, May, and so on. So if Eiko felt safer to travel the 5 miles, she could have completed most of that school year. Does that make sense in terms of the timeline? Okay, so you felt that your friends were ignoring you even before you went to the camps, and that was painful for you.
It was, yeah.
And then staying home when you could have been going to school, but you were too afraid.
Right.
Yeah, I mean that's pretty. Oh, I get goosebumps just thinking about that. Yeah, those must have been so hard. Those months when before you were removed, your bank accounts are frozen. So how did your family live?
Well, we had a hard time, very hard time. Yeah, but compared to him, see, I'm what you call a city girl. I grew up in Seattle. He comes from San Jose in the country, so they had ample food where we city folks had to buy whatever you ate. They could raise their vegetables and everything. We couldn't, in our particular situation. So there again, there's a difference,
So when you sold your refrigerator for $10, that probably the $10 went to food.
Yeah, that helped.
Uh-huh.
But we sold it. I mean, got rid of our bedding and all that, whatever we owned.
You just sold anything you could to make ends meet till the Army took you away.
Yeah, so it was whatever we could carry is all we could take with us. So everything we left behind, what we didn't sell.
And I don't know if you know this, but most things were sold at really cheap prices because bargain hunters were taking advantage of the fact that so many Japanese Americans were selling off their things. So like a big garage sale.
Yeah. That's what it amounts to.
Yeah.
I think it was not a garage sale. There was opportunists coming along there. They knew either they leave it behind and let it rot on the field, or get something out of it. So some people just forgot. They didn't sell. Like you probably read the book Farewell to Manzanar, how the mother was offered for the fine china, like 10 cents, well, I think a nickel and a dollar, and she said, before I sell it to you for 10 cents each, I'm gonna break. So she broke every piece of chinaware that she had to satisfy the people. But I think, you have to understand us, the Japanese American living in this country. In 1930, the Naval Intelligence Service was watching, surveilling all the Japanese Americans, even myself, even born in this country. And later on in 1934, 35, FBI came in the picture, was tracing all the Japanese Americans. They knew exactly where we were at given time. So when the war started, they were there. If Mr. Doi was to go to the grocery store and have a cup of coffee with his friend or something like that, at 10 o'clock, they'll go to the store and pick him up right there. Mr. Doi, he's the one person that can be picked up because he's a possible spy or whatever it was, because it was the East Side. So
Mr. Doi was your father's friend?
yeah.
Okay.
But the thing is, today, just punch it the computer, the name will come up, and the given status name. Back then was all telephone. So everybody had a master list. When the war broke out, in a week's time, they picked up 2,000 East States and some citizen, and they knew where they were without any warning. They picked them up, took them into confinement. Now you have 2,000 men, regardless. To pick up one man, one person, it took at least 2 or 3 person. So that army of 6,000 men already to pick up the East State folks. In turn, they already had a place for them. So somebody knew something that nobody else knew.
Okay.
So Missoula, Montana was 1,200 folks were there. The rest of them went to Fort Lincoln, Bismarck, North Dakota, and
So Jimmy, you can tell he can teach a whole year's course on this because he has numbers in his head like this. No matter what happens, you don't forget it.
Yeah.
But I think they're interested in knowing your own experience. So the
Yeah.
question was, okay, so Mr. Jim Yamaichi had sort of backtracked to right after Pearl Harbor when all these community leaders were picked up and how the FBI already knew before Pearl Harbor was bombed. So that's the connection here. So
okay, I'll tell you.
how about your own personal experiences
Well,
with racial discrimination?
Own personal experience.
Yeah.
We used to sell produce to a Consolidated Produce House in Los Angeles. They were one of the biggest produce houses west of the Mississippi River. And we've done business with them for about 15, 20 years. Anyway, my father got to know the buyer, Ted Myers, a small, chubby man. My father was about 5 foot tall. He was about 5 foot tall. And he'd make the rounds. He liked to drink, so he'd come back and he'd just drink with my dad. And the day the war broke out, Ted Myers came by the house, says, Yamaichi's, and my boss is calling me. I'm going to drive down there. He didn't want to take the train. It's a 12-hour trip to drive back then. No freeway, nothing.
To
Two-lane
LA.
road, up and down. Anyway, so he left. Then Wednesday here, he showed up at the house again. Said, Ted, says, I thought you went to Los Angeles. Yes. He says, he leaned over, I could still see he cried on my father's shoulder. He says, all of you are going to be put away in camp. That's 3 days after the war. 3 days after the war. Now, why? The Japanese American controlled 51% of the industry, California industry, and we were less than 2% of the population.
The agricultural industry.
The farming, the vegetable farming business. Not the fruit, just the vegetables, just the vegetables only. And to break the monopoly, because even the selling in the produce market, they would not let them into the produce market, so they opened their own produce market in Los Angeles. They call it 9th Street Market. And they were getting stronger, stronger, stronger. Now, what made this happen? Like all of you here sitting in the classroom, even though, like my older brother and the older nieces went to college, whatever field they took in, they could never get a job in the field they went to school. So they all had to revert back to the farm, regardless what you went to. Maybe it was a accountant or whatever it is. Maybe then you might find a job at a grocery store. But anyway, so they all put their effort into one thing, farming. That's all they can do. So that's the reason why the strength of the farming was so strong, getting bigger and bigger. You figure less than 2% of the population controlling 51% of the industry, one industry, the vegetable industry. So they saw a good chance to put us away. Anyway, Ted Myers told my dad, my boss told me to look at any good farm equipment, this and that. We're going to buy them up. We're going to kick them all out. So start doing it. The poor guy, he was so heartbroken that he died before he even got started, because we used to specialize in cucumber. He used to buy the cucumber every week. 200 boxes on Tuesday and Saturday was shipped to Los Angeles.
Wow.
So I think, then you go someplace else, other vegetables, so you'll put a whole load and send to Los Angeles, but
So you're talking about the racism that the white agricultural giants were able to. I'm going to add to what Mr. Yamaichi was saying. Their family friend knew 2 or 3 days after Pearl Harbor was bombed that the government would eventually force the Japanese American population out of the West Coast into camps because the white growers had such a big lobbying power that they could influence the president to sign an executive order like this. Does that make sense? And in fact, they bragged about it in their newsletter about how they were going to kick out the Japs. Right? And they use that word all the time. So Mr. Yamaichi's father's friend had foreknowledge that eventually the president would be forced into, by lobbyists and so on, to sign an executive order. I mean, that's pretty incredible, the power of the lobbyists and the amount of racism that was there that they could petition such a thing, and for President Roosevelt to actually listen to such an outrageous proposal. So that's what your personal experience to that.
I think the other thing, just one thing I'd like to mention. Now we're sending 200 boxes of cucumber to Los Angeles. 200 boxes. There's 4 or 5 of us in the family. We'll spend 3 days getting ready to ship 200 boxes of cucumber. Now we got 10 cents a lug, a box of cucumber. The empty box cost us 5 cents.
Oh.
Now what did we make? 200 times 5 cents? That's what depression was all about.
You're just amazing. You're such an encyclopedia. I just want to check with you. Is this going okay the way you wanted to? Is there should we focus on the camp experience? Okay. So, Mr. Yamaichi, you were first, I just want to give you a little background. There were assembly centers and then there were camps. Assembly centers were generally within the military zone along the West Coast. So most Japanese Americans who went to the camps had already been displaced once and then went to a camp. But Mr. Yamaichi's family, I know you went to at least 3 locations. The first assembly center, which was the Pomona, and then you were sent to Hart Mountain, and then you were sent to Tule Lake. And how about you?
Yeah, from Seattle down to Fresno.
To Fresno?
Yeah.
To
Tule Lake.
Tule Lake?
And then to Arkansas, Jerome.
Arkansas.
Then to Gila, Arizona.
And then to another one in Arizona. So I don't know if you knew this, but so which camps should we talk about? There are so many camps to talk about. Can you talk? I think most people want to know about your feelings, how it made you feel to be imprisoned for no reason, really, and how you, not just how you felt for the experiences you had to go through, but now looking back on it. And then there are other questions, but maybe we can focus on how it felt to be incarcerated. Can we start with you, Eiko?
First of all, I have to say that going to high school back home in Washington, there was only 4 Japanese Americans in the whole school. And the whole student body was, I think, 300 of us. So it was a small country school. But anyway, here I am, and then all of a sudden we were sent to Assembly Center, and I'm looking around, and they're all black heads. I've never seen so many Japanese people before. And then we were there a couple months until the military and the government was able to make a facility for us to go in a more permanent area, which was a relocation center. And as the barracks were completed, most of us were slowly transferred over to the camp. Yeah. And then in my particular case, I was removed from Tule Lake because of a questionnaire.
But I think we
Yeah,
can
not
focus
that.
on how it felt you were in junior high.
Yeah, I was junior high, so my adjustment, and then also there was a group from Washington, myself, a group from California, and so there was this kind of a feeling between the Japanese Americans from Washington and California, and it took a little while for us to all gel together. Whether it was because we were from an entirely different area and we thought differently or what, I have no idea. I can't pinpoint that. But anyway, it took a few months for us to get together, you know, start to understand.
So to make friends and
Yeah,
things like that.
made friends.
So Eiko is speaking as a young student and not really knowing how much money your parents lost.
That's true.
And the whole social scene is such a big deal and you're healthy, so you're not, did you notice how she wasn't concentrating on the dust or the fact that they were in these barracks or the fact that her rights were taken? She's focusing you were focusing on friendships and gelling and who are these people from California and ooh, I'm in California now, or up in Tule Lake, that was still Northern California.
Yeah.
So as a young person, you could get caught up in just making friends and that kind of adjustment.
Yeah, because people from Oregon too, see. So.
And that was all exciting. As a group of girls, did you have a feeling, did you talk about racial discrimination? Did you commiserate with each other?
In my own personal situation, I being the oldest daughter, and I had a mother who was very hypochondriac, so she was mostly in bed all the time, and I had to be the mother figure to my two brothers. Therefore, socially, my so-called camp life was not quite the same as some of the teenagers who had a lot of fun because they were active in high school. Oh, I have to backtrack. How the government decided to have K to 12 classes, I really don't know, because when it first school started, it was done by the evacuees. A lot of college students who did not graduate or who graduated already found the need for us youngsters to have something concrete to do, and so they started little classes for different grades, and so then that's how the educational part came to be. And then the office staff decided, well, we better have some kind of a regulated educational forum, you know, and so we got our education, we got all used books and, you know, make to do with tables and all that, but
So you were part of that,
Yeah.
and you observed it.
yeah.
Okay, so Eiko touched on how difficult it was when you had a hypochondriac mom.
Yeah. So my job
Yeah.
was to bring some money in, and at that time, if you were professional, then you got $19 a month, and then if you're not quite as in that category, you got $17. Wasn't that right? $16, and I got $12 because I was a student yet, and I was going to high school, trying to finish up my junior year in camp, and then going to the hospital to work to earn my $12 a month, so that I could contribute my $12 toward the family coffer, you know. And then my father was earning $16, so his $16 and my $12, that was for the whole month.
So instead of fretting about racism or commiserating with your friends, you were just trying to make ends meet. You were trying to take care of your hypochondriac mom, who obviously, because conditions were bad, she must have had even more physical
Right.
complaints. And then here you're the oldest, so you're having to take care of your younger kids
Right.
and go to school and earn money.
Right.
So that was more responsibilities for you because of all this, being in the camps and the hardships. Okay. You didn't have time to commiserate about racism then, did
No,
you? Not really.
My own business.
Yeah, yeah, okay. So it was about survival. How about you, Jimmy?
As far as camp life,
The question was about how you felt being incarcerated for no reason, really. I guess because of racism and failure of leadership.
well, at the time, as they were being taken into what they call assembly centers, they were all temporary quarters. There were, I think, 16 altogether on the West Coast. And the first group was like 84,000 of us was incarcerated almost immediately. But as we got into camps, a lot of them showed the loyalty. They want to join the armed forces. They were not allowed to join the armed forces, especially Navy didn't want them, period. No, the Marines, no, Air Corps, no. Only place you can go is walking soldiers, but even that they didn't want them. So you hear that kind of story. It says, what's happening in the United States? I mean, here you're an American citizen, you want to fight for a country, but you're not allowed to join. In the meantime, we went to camp, and by October of 1942, 120,000 of us was behind barbed wire fence. Then as soon as we were all behind barbed wire fence, people don't know what draft status is. That is called 1A. You're fit for the Army and so forth. There's a different category. And I was already 19 already, almost going to 20. And I carried a 1A card, ready to go be drafted into the Army. When the fall of 42, our draft status was changed to 4C. We're all enemy aliens. Here we're American citizens, we're classified enemy aliens. We cannot vote, we cannot leave, we're behind barbed wire fence.
So that's a huge insult.
So thing like that,
Yeah.
you really get frustrated. Now, what's happening here? We're American citizens, but we're enemy aliens, like the enemy they were fighting. We have nothing to do with the war, so it was quite frustrating at the time when we went to camp, especially when we went to relocation centers.
All right, so Mr. Yamaichi is talking about, the difference if you're a female or male, if you're in junior high/high school versus pretty much an adult. And back then, young men felt proud to serve the country all across the board. It was this exciting thing. And so he was of that age. And to be reclassified from draftable to not draftable, to be classified from just being an American citizen to enemy, alien, even though you're an American, those things really hit you hard. So we're not talking about using words like depression or insulted, but both of them are letting us know the kinds of things that they were experiencing, and it's partly Japanese culture that we don't express our feelings. That's still on, but they're giving us the data with which we can imagine how they might have felt. What are we doing the time?
Maybe you want to see if there are any questions.
Any questions? Yeah, because I think out of all these, about 50 questions, I think we nailed one. We have 5 minutes, is that right? Is there a burning question that we should tackle? Yes.
I'm kind of curious how, they said a lot about how the frustrations built up from not being able to be drafted and everything. And I'm kind of curious just how much, did any of those frustrations ever boil over? Did anyone try to go back at them? Or how'd you keep those frustrations down? Do you have a mentor that was calming everyone down kind of thing? Because there must have been some frustrations towards
All right, we might go off tangent a little bit. Okay, so this gentleman is asking about your feelings around being draftable or not draftable. Actually, this opens a whole can of worms because
You can say that again.
You can have a whole semester course on this whole thing about drafting and not drafting and yeah, dodging the draft and conscientious objector and who served and who didn't and how many Japanese Americans felt like they were cannon fodders once they did get served, right? So which part should we do?
Well, I'll fast like trying to answer his questions. Okay, in the latter part of 43, they decided to form an all Japanese American army to fight the European theater. So they reinstated us back to 1A. Now we're draftable. So in March of 1944, I received a draft notice. I was in camp behind barbed wire fence, double fence, 28 guard towers in 1 1/4 square mile. But anyway, I got my draft notice to report.
Was that exciting?
Yeah, in Tui Lake.
Was that exciting? He says.
Well, Tui Lake at the time was a very hostile camp. I mean, there was the feelings were running very high. You don't talk to nobody about anything. You just kind of keep your mouth shut. And you decide on your own, what shall I do? Shall I go or shall I fight this situation? So it's a personal opinion, personal deal. So I decided not to go. My father says, it's up to you. I mean, so there was 26 of us of the same situation. So we did not report. And then come in July, we got a notice that the U.S. Marshal will pick you up and take to court to try you for draft evasion. So there was 26 of us, like I said earlier, was picked up, taken to Eureka, California. That's had the summer court, the federal judge, and moved the story around fast there. The judge felt, Judge Goodman, he looked at our case and naturally asked you, what kind of condition you live under? We're under barbed wire fence, Army guards around us, and so forth. Fast like it says 18,700 of us was in Tui Lake camp, and there were 1,200 soldiers guarding us, men, women, and children. You get a penitentiary, you got 30,000 men, there are only 300 guards around you. But anyway, the Judge Goodman looked at our situation and then made a decision. Says, you were not given due process of the law, so you'd be exonerated. Plus, the draft law stipulates you have to be an American citizen that's free, not incarcerated, nothing. You got to be a free man to be drafted. We're not a free man. Well, our rights were taken away. We could not vote for our go out to vote, right?
Yeah.
So he exonerated us. Meantime, there were other camps there, there's 10 camps altogether. The most notorious one was Heart Mountain, Wyoming. There were over 200, almost 300 draft. They said, you give us the rights back, we'll join the Army right now. So they went to court, and the judge says, you evaded the draft. Now, the same draft law, they say you evaded the draft, so they got 3 years in federal penitentiary. They lost their American citizen rights. When you go in federal penitentiary, you're not an American citizen, you can't vote, nothing. You just completely lost everything. But President Truman at the time, when he was still serving as president, he felt it was not right, and he pardoned all the Japanese American men that went to federal penitentiary and restored their American citizenship rights. So there it is. I mean, it's just my story. I'll just shut it off there.
Done well.
There's more to it.
Done well. Done well. I usually like to close by giving our speakers a chance to say one sentence, something. If you want this audience to remember one thing, what would it be?
One thing, I'll talk about my mother. The Japanese immigrants came from Japan. They were one of the last ethnic groups that was allowed to get to naturalized citizenship. In 1952, the Congress passed a law, McCarran Act. Even that was vetoed by President Truman, but they overruled his veto and passed a law, and the Japanese were able to get their citizenship. And my mother, not speaking much English at all, one day I was there, the house, and she was mumbling away. And what you doing, Mom? Says, I got to learn this. And my inspector says, I have to learn this. Now, how many of you could recite the Gettysburg Address 407 years ago, our forefather folks, or the preamble of the United States?
She memorized them?
And then the 10 Amendments of the Constitution. That's part of the test. She had to cite all the 10 Amendments of the Constitution, recite the preamble. But anyway, my father passed away earlier, and my mom was left behind. He had the farm. And my brother says, Mom, says, you should put the land in trust. That way there we don't have to pay so much income, inheritance tax. My mom told my brother, says, you know, America been good to me, she says. What the inheritance tax you pay, that's my debt to the United States. I want you to pay the income inheritance tax. That's my duty as an American citizen. So we pay a pretty healthy inheritance tax. That was my mom's wishes. Mind you, now all the hardships she went through, yet she felt that America was her country.
Wow, I'll remember that. Aiko,
Yeah.
what would you like them to remember? One thing.
That regardless of what happened to myself or to the rest of Japanese Americans and all, the United States is still the best country. We are able to speak what we want, and to a certain point, we have our freedom. But I want all of you to remember that this is all part of history. Unfortunately, it happened to us, but hopefully the government will not do that to any other nationality or any other race. And if that does happen, I hope all of you will stand up and fight for your rights.